Welcome, sleepy souls. I am your storyteller, Mr. Dread. Tonight, I'm here to help you drift into deep, peaceful sleep. But before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime stories. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. And if there's a story you'd like to hear next, I would love to know that too. What if midnight was a lie? The thought struck me the moment I rolled into Ashwood, my hometown, after nearly a decade away. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet for a Friday evening, and the streetlights flickered like hesitant memories. I had returned to settle my parents' affairs after their sudden passing, expecting grief, nostalgia, and maybe some awkward reunions, but nothing could have prepared me for the unease that wrapped around the town like fog. Driving past the old diner, I noticed the neon sign blinking 11:58 p.m. over and over, frozen in time. I laughed at first, assuming a malfunction. But then I checked my watch, and it said exactly the same. I glanced at the church clock, the gas station, the wall of the library. It was as though time itself refused to move past the single, cursed minute. My stomach tightened. Something about it felt deliberate. I parked in front of my parents' house. The front door, which had always creaked in that familiar way, now seemed to loom like a sentinel. Inside, the house was untouched, a time capsule of my childhood. Dust motes danced in the dim lamplight, and the scent of old wood mixed with faint traces of lavender. I half expected them to appear in the hallway, calling me for dinner, though I knew they were gone. That comforting familiarity twisted into something sinister when I noticed that the grandfather clock, a fixture of my memories, had stopped at 11:59. I spent the first few hours unpacking boxes, sifting through decades of photographs and letters. Yet every glance at the wall clocks left me uneasy. Friends and neighbors dropped by, ostensibly to offer condolences. Yet their smiles were too wide, their eyes too sharp. "You mustn't stay awake too long tonight," one woman warned casually as she pressed a plate of cookies into my hands. "It's safer if you sleep before it changes." "Changes?" I asked, startled. She shrugged. "Time, it doesn't quite behave the way you remember. Midnight isn't, like you think." Her words should have been comforting, but they sounded more like a threat. I laughed nervously and excused myself, retreating to my childhood room. The shadows in the corners seemed unusually deep, almost liquid. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the creeping sensation that the house itself was waiting for something. But then the wind whispered through the cracks in the window, forming shapes I couldn't fully identify. And though the hour hand hovered near 12, not a single clock in the house would advance beyond 11:59. Curiosity gnawed at me, and against every instinct, I wandered outside. The streets of Ashwood were silent, completely deserted. I noticed the faint glow of lamps in other homes, but the people inside didn't move. It was as if time had stalled not just in my parents' house but throughout the entire town. And then I saw a shadow flit across the corner of my eye, a figure at the end of the street, frozen mid-step. I called out, but the figure didn't respond, and when I blinked, it was gone. Returning inside, I checked the newspaper on the kitchen table. The date was correct. The day of the week matched. Headlines reported trivial events from last week, but the timestamp on the clock in the corner still insisted it was 11:59 p.m. Panic started to claw at my chest. Something was wrong. Something I couldn't name yet. I fell asleep, or perhaps blacked out, in my childhood bed, haunted by dreams of clocks spinning backward and streets stretching endlessly under a moon that refused to rise. In my dream, the townsfolk gathered silently around me, their faces blurred, their mouths moving but no sound coming out. A bell tolled faintly, or maybe it didn't, and I woke with my heart racing, sweat soaking my shirt. When I opened my eyes, the room was unchanged, yet eerily still. I glanced at the clock, 11:59. I jumped to my feet and ran to the window, expecting to see dawn. But outside, the town lay cloaked in fog, the streetlights flickering as though resisting the arrival of morning. And that's when I realized, no matter what I did, I couldn't wait for midnight. It would never come. The next day, I ventured out, determined to confront the townsfolk about the bizarre stasis. I stopped by the diner, hoping for explanations or, at least, a semblance of normal life. The waitress smiled, too sweetly, her eyes flicking toward the door with a cautious glance. "You're new here?" she asked. I live here," I said. "Well, I grew up here." Her smile widened. "Then you should know the rules. Don't let midnight catch you awake. Stay in your room, or sleep before it strikes." I frowned. "You keep saying that, but midnight never comes. Every clock I've seen stops at 11:59. She froze, the words dying on her lips. Then she leaned closer, voice a whisper. "That's exactly what it's supposed to do. Midnight doesn't exist here. And if you stay awake, you'll see things you're not meant to see." I wanted answers. But her gaze warned me that the answers might be worse than the questions. And that night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I heard it, the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock. It was coming from the street outside, or maybe from inside my own head. It wasn't the familiar mechanical tick, but something deeper, older. Something that pulsed in sync with my own heartbeat. Against my better judgment, I stayed awake past 11:59. My eyes strained to pierce the darkness. And then it began, the subtle shift in the world that I had feared. Shadows stretched unnaturally. The fog thickened into shapes I recognized, faces of childhood friends, neighbors long gone, all frozen in silent terror, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. And I realized, with a jolt of fear that rooted me to the bed, that Ashwood had been hiding this, something unspeakable. Something that only revealed itself when the night passed the time that never existed. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. My heart pounded as the house seemed to breathe around me, every creak of the floorboards echoing with intent. I had crossed a threshold that the town warned against, and now there was no turning back. Whatever the town had been hiding, I was about to see it, and I knew it would change everything I thought I knew about Ashwood, and maybe about myself. I couldn't sleep. Not that I had a choice. The moment my eyes closed, the town seemed to shift around me. Every creak of the old floorboards became a warning, every shadow outside my window a silent spectator. By the time I forced myself upright, the house was shrouded in an unnatural fog, the kind that wasn't mist but more like a liquid smothering the streets and swallowing familiar landmarks. The first night's hesitation had passed, now I had no doubts. Something in Ashwood was alive, and it had been waiting for me to cross the invisible line of 11:59. Determined to understand, I left my childhood home for the first time since arriving. The street lamps flickered erratically as if struggling to illuminate a reality that resisted clarity. Windows across the town glimmered with faint movement, but the figures inside remained still, frozen in the smallest gestures, pouring coffee, turning a page, a child raising a hand mid-wave, but their eyes were empty, and they didn't breathe. The further I walked, the more I realized the town had changed, subtly but unmistakably. Houses that had once been a certain shape were now twisted slightly, corners sharper, doors taller, windows longer. Ashwood was breathing, shifting imperceptibly, and the streets themselves seemed to curve around me, guiding me to somewhere I didn't want to go. I reached the old town square, where the clock tower should have been striking midnight. Instead, it remained stubbornly frozen at 11:59. I could feel the collective tension of the town pressing in, a weight that made my limbs heavy. And then, from the fog, a sound emerged, not the mechanical tick of the clock, but a low hum, vibrating through the cobblestones beneath my feet. It was a sound that carried memory, knowledge, and menace all at once, and I felt my mind stretch, as if the town itself were probing, testing the limits of my awareness. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the haze. At first, I thought it was a child, tiny, delicate, waving, but as it came closer, I realized something was wrong. Its features flickered, unstable, like a poorly tuned television. The face resembled someone I knew, someone I thought I had known, but shifted in impossible ways with each step. The eyes were too bright, too focused, staring into me as if they could peel back my thoughts and reveal every fear I had tried to hide. "Don't," it whispered in a voice that echoed strangely, both inside and outside my head. "Don't stay past 11:59. My pulse spiked, but curiosity, and perhaps defiance, overpowered fear. "Why?" I shouted. "What happens if I do?" The figure wavered, and then it was gone, absorbed by the fog as though it had never existed. Yet its warning lingered, resonating through the streets and into my chest. I knew then that the town had rules, rules I had been ignorant of all my life. But understanding them was another matter entirely. Something fundamental had shifted in Ashwood, something that had turned time itself into a trap, and I had stumbled directly into it. Returning to my parents' house, I noticed subtle changes even there. The grandfather clock ticked, but the pendulum swung irregularly, sometimes slow, sometimes too fast, as though the house itself was confused, or perhaps mocking me. The air smelled faintly of burned paper and wet stone, a combination I had never encountered, yet it was vaguely familiar, like a memory I couldn't place. I sat on the edge of my bed, rubbing my temples, trying to make sense of the impossibility I was experiencing. I opened one of my old journals, hoping that familiar handwriting would anchor me. But the words had changed. Sentences I remembered writing a decade ago now described events that had never happened, or worse, events that had happened, but not to me. Names of people I knew, or thought I knew, were replaced by faces I didn't recognize, yet their actions seemed intimately familiar. It was as if Ashwood itself had rewritten the past to accommodate this frozen, eternal moment before midnight. The night stretched on. Or perhaps it didn't. I had lost all sense of time. Every glance at the clock reinforced the cruel joke, 11:59. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, creeping along the walls, reaching toward me with deliberate intent. And then came the whispers, faint at first, like wind through the cracks, but gradually forming words, phrases, half-sentences. "Don't see, not yet, never wake." The language was almost intelligible, but I caught enough to know it was a warning, and not for someone else. Compelled by a mixture of fear and obsession, I ventured outside once more, this time walking toward the edge of town, where the forest began. Locals always avoided it, claiming strange lights and sounds came from the trees at night, but the fog here seemed thicker, darker, alive. The whispers grew louder, echoing in the treetops, circling me, and I felt a cold wind that wasn't wind at all brush across my neck. I froze. Something moved among the trees, something humanoid, but elongated, impossibly tall, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly like embers. Before I could react, a voice behind me hissed, "You shouldn't be here. Go back. Sleep before 11:59. I spun around. The figure was one of the townsfolk I had seen that morning, a man I recognized, yet his expression was entirely wrong, twisted into a mask of horror and warning. He stepped forward, but the fog swallowed him before he could get closer. I ran, heart hammering, retracing my steps to the town square, only to realize the streets had subtly shifted. Familiar houses now loomed farther apart, corners that used to meet now created endless alleys. It was impossible geometry, yet it felt like the town itself was reshaping, testing, guiding me towards something I dreaded. Back at my parents' house, I barricaded the doors, but I felt no safety. The whispers had followed me inside. They circled the room, and I realized they weren't outside threats, they were coming from inside me. Memories I had never shared, secrets I had buried, fears I hadn't acknowledged, they were now vocal, articulate, screaming warnings I could neither ignore nor fully understand. And beneath them all, a steady, unrelenting beat, the rhythm of time that refused to progress, the heartbeat of 11:59. And then I understood, with a clarity that chilled me to the bone, the town had been hiding something for decades, maybe centuries. Something that only revealed itself past the minute that never existed. Something that couldn't tolerate witnesses. Something that would consume anyone foolish enough to see what happened when the world actually struck midnight. I looked at the clock. 11:59, again. And I made a choice, a terrible, defiant choice. I would stay awake. I had to see. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the clock, feeling every nerve in my body hum with tension. 11:59. I had promised myself I wouldn't cross the threshold, that I'd follow the town's unspoken rules. But something darker, curiosity, defiance, or madness, pushed me to wait, eyes wide, heart hammering, as the seconds stretched into an eternity. The air in the room thickened, vibrating with an energy that was almost palpable, a low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The shadows in the corners began to twitch, elongating, reaching toward me as though they were aware of my defiance. Then it happened. Time cracked. The hands on every clock spun backward and forward in impossible sequences, overlapping themselves, spinning like whirlpools. The grandfather clock groaned as if in pain, its pendulum jerking violently. Outside, the fog thickened, and the town, my town, twisted and warped. Buildings grew taller, alleys lengthened into impossible dimensions, and the familiar streets of Ashwood became a labyrinth of shifting shadows. I could hear whispers now, unmistakably human, murmuring from every corner, from every crack in the walls, filling the house with their cold, urgent voices. A sound like glass shattering echoed through the room, and I realized it was my own reflection in the mirror across from my bed. But it wasn't quite me. My eyes were darker, hollow, and my face twisted into a silent scream I hadn't made. I recoiled, stumbling backward. The mirror warped, the surface rippling like water. Through it, I saw the town outside, not as it was now, but as it had been. Faces pressed against windows that didn't exist anymore, shadows of townsfolk frozen mid-action, trapped in moments they had never left. And then I saw them, the people who had warned me, neighbors, old classmates, strangers whose names I didn't remember but whose faces were burned into the town's memory. They were all staring at me through the mist, eyes bright and empty, mouths opening and closing without sound. The whispers intensified. "Welcome, awake, don't return, stay forever." I realized with a jolt that the town didn't just hide its secret, it fed on it. Ashwood wasn't a town, it was a predator, patient and precise, and midnight, the non-existent midnight, was its trap. I bolted from my bed, running to the window. The streets outside were alive, twisting and bending in impossible geometry. People moved in unison, stepping from shadows into light, faces serene but unseeing, as though their consciousness had been replaced by something older, something inhuman. A figure emerged from the fog, taller than any man, its limbs stretching and folding like shadows made real. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth opened impossibly wide in a grin that showed no teeth, only endless darkness. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug, and fell hard. I realized then that I could no longer trust my senses. The walls were breathing, expanding and contracting with each beat of my heart. The floor beneath me undulated like water, carrying faint echoes of footsteps that weren't mine. And yet, amidst the chaos, a singular clarity emerged. Ashwood was hiding something monumental, something terrible, and it had been waiting for me all these years. I ran to the door, desperate to escape. But the hallway stretched infinitely, the front door receding farther down a corridor that had never existed. The pictures on the walls, family portraits, childhood snapshots, shifted and changed before my eyes. Faces blurred, identities replaced with strangers, memories warped into twisted versions of reality. I felt a cold, deliberate presence brush against my shoulder, but when I turned, no one was there. Only the whispering grew louder, forming words I could now understand. "You should not have woken. You belong to midnight now." Panic overwhelmed me. I sprinted through the house, doors and windows vanishing into blank walls, the ceiling stretching upward like a tunnel to infinity. The house itself was alive, pulsating with a heartbeat that matched my own, or perhaps replaced it entirely. I could hear the floorboards creaking, not under my weight, but under the weight of some unseen entity pacing, circling, waiting. I tried screaming, but no sound came out, only a hollow echo that belonged to the building itself. I stumbled into my parents' bedroom. The bed was gone. In its place, the room had transformed into an empty void, walls dissolving into mist. And there, standing in the center, was a figure, a reflection of me, but older, twisted, eyes glowing with the same hollow darkness I had seen in the mirror. Its lips moved, but no sound emerged. Then the whispers around me coalesced into a voice, deep and resonant, echoing from every direction. Midnight is never yours. Midnight belongs to us. You cannot leave. You cannot return. You cannot exist as you once did. My knees buckled. The room spun. Shapes formed in the fog outside, glimpses of forgotten faces, of neighbors long dead, of children who had vanished, of townsfolk who had warned me and now were part of the town itself, their humanity stripped and absorbed into its eternal moment. I realized the truth. Ashwood didn't just hide midnight. It erased it. It devoured the threshold between night and day, and anyone who stayed awake long enough to see past 11:59 became a permanent part of its machinery. And then, the final horror, the figure that mirrored me began to step forward. Its movements were deliberate, impossible, a defiance of every law of physics I understood. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I understood without thinking, this wasn't just a shadow, or a reflection. It was what I would become if I didn't escape. I had crossed the threshold, awakened what had been lying in wait, and now there was no turning back. The town pulsed around me, alive, watching, ready to claim me as it had claimed countless others. My only chance was to flee, but even as I ran toward the hallway, I saw that every door, every window, every familiar escape route had disappeared. Ashwood had reshaped itself into a trap, infinite and inevitable. And then the whispering reached a crescendo. 11:59 is eternal. You cannot survive midnight. I froze, paralyzed. Outside, the fog thickened. Shapes emerged, forms I recognized, forms I didn't, but all watching, all waiting. The town itself was alive, hungry, and patient. And I understood the final truth in a single, gut-wrenching moment. If I didn't find a way out before the next minute ticked past, I would be absorbed, forgotten, a permanent fixture in Ashwood's endless pre-midnight purgatory. I realized then that escaping might not even be possible. But I had to try. I stumbled through the house, every step echoing in a space that seemed both familiar and impossibly wrong. The floor beneath me was soft in some places, rigid in others, as though the house itself was aware of my panic and reshaping to challenge it. The walls pulsed with a dim, reddish light, not from any lamp or bulb, but as if the structure itself bled illumination. Shadows danced along the corners, elongating into humanoid forms that swayed, twisted, and merged with one another in ways that defied logic. I tried to scream, but no sound came, my voice trapped in my throat, absorbed by the oppressive energy that thickened the air. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping. Not from the floors or windows, but from inside the walls themselves, rhythmic and mocking. Step by step, I traced the sound to the old staircase, leading to the attic I had long avoided as a child. Something compelled me forward, a mix of fear, curiosity, and an instinct I couldn't name. Each step on the creaking stairs felt like a descent into some otherworldly depth, where gravity was inconsistent, where the past and present collided. I reached the attic doorway and paused, my heart hammering as the tapping stopped abruptly. Silence fell, heavy and expectant. Pushing the door open, I entered a space that was no longer an attic but a vast, cavernous void. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, and the floor stretched endlessly, covered in thick, shifting fog. In the center of the space, I saw them, figures suspended in midair, their bodies distorted, faces frozen in expressions of agony and terror. These were the townsfolk I had glimpsed before, some familiar, others strangers, all caught in the eternal grasp of Ashwood. Their eyes, wide and empty, followed my every movement, and I realized that the town didn't just trap people, it twisted them into eternal witnesses, observers who could never intervene, never speak, never move. A whisper brushed against my ear, and I spun around. There was no one, yet the voice was unmistakable. "You cannot leave. You belong to 11:59. It was not angry or threatening in a conventional sense, it was matter of fact, chilling in its inevitability. My stomach churned as I understood. Ashwood didn't merely stop time, it claimed those who disobeyed its rules, converting them into instruments of its control, ensuring the cycle continued. I pressed forward through the fog, desperate to find some exit. The figures in the void began to stir, reaching toward me with elongated limbs, their faces twitching into grotesque mockeries of the expressions they had worn in life. I stumbled backward, heart racing, tripping over a floorboard that shifted beneath my feet as if the house were alive, testing my resolve. My mind screamed at me to run, but the attic seemed infinite, stretching far beyond the limits of the house I had known. Then I saw it, a faint light in the distance, pulsing like a heartbeat. It drew me in, almost hypnotically, and I realized it was not an exit but a focus, a center of Ashwood's power. Shadows circled it, writhing like smoke, and I could hear whispers merging into coherent phrases: "Welcome, witness, stay, never leave." The air vibrated with their voices, resonating in my bones, and I felt the town probing my very consciousness, testing my fear, assessing my weakness. Summoning what courage I had left, I ran toward the light. As I approached, the shadows recoiled slightly, as though recognizing the threat I posed by surviving this long. I glimpsed faces among the darkness, neighbors, childhood friends, parents long gone, all trapped, watching me, their eyes filled with a silent plea I could not interpret. And then I saw the first true horror of Ashwood, a figure that resembled me exactly, down to the smallest detail, standing perfectly still, waiting for me. Its eyes glowed with an eerie phosphorescence, hollow but aware. It was not my reflection, not a twin, it was a copy, an entity created by the town itself, forged to replace or claim me the moment I faltered. The figure spoke without moving its lips, its voice resonating in my mind rather than my ears. "You cannot leave. You have crossed the threshold. Midnight belongs to us. You are ours." Panic surged. I backed away, only to find the fog thickening, the attic elongating further, twisting into impossible corridors. Every memory of my childhood home became unreliable, the walls shifted, staircases appeared where there had been none, windows opened onto streets that should not exist. I realized that Ashwood wasn't just alive, it was sentient, adaptive, feeding on my fear, my attempts to escape. I ran, trying to find the staircase back to my room, but the attic had become a labyrinth. Shapes emerged from the fog, hands reaching, faces staring, shadows mimicking movement I hadn't made. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, repeating, a chorus of inevitability: "Stay, belong, witness." My chest burned, lungs gasping as if the air itself resisted my effort to survive. And then I felt it, an unnatural pressure behind my eyes, a sensation that my mind itself was being observed, rewritten, judged. Ashwood did not merely trap the body, it ensnared the soul. I stumbled upon a small landing, a door hanging loosely from its hinges. Hope surged. I flung it open, expecting sunlight, escape, or at least a familiar corridor. Instead, I faced an endless void, a mirror of the town itself, stretching infinitely in all directions. And at the center, glowing faintly against the darkness, was a clock, its hands frozen at 11:59, but the pendulum swinging with a heartbeat that was not mine. From its depths, the whispers coalesced into a single, coherent message. You cannot survive the minute that never was. You cannot resist the town. You will belong, as all before you have. I realized then that Ashwood's secret was no longer avoidable. The town itself was a predator, patient, eternal, and I was now its prey. And the horrifying truth crystallized: survival was not a matter of escape. Survival required understanding the impossible, defying reality itself, and even then, the cost might be more than I could bear. I stood frozen, staring at the clock, knowing that my next move would determine whether I became just another shadow in the fog, or the one who might uncover the truth behind Ashwood's eternal pre-midnight curse. I forced myself to move, though every fiber of my being screamed to stay frozen, to surrender to the oppressive weight of the town. The infinite void of the attic stretched endlessly before me, punctuated only by the frozen clock and faint outlines of figures trapped in the fog. Shadows twisted and shifted, taking on forms both familiar and grotesque. I recognized some of them, neighbors, friends, even teachers from my childhood, but their faces were warped, hollowed out by the eternal pre-midnight that held them captive. Their eyes followed me, pleading without sound, warning me in ways that I could not yet comprehend. I pressed forward, my feet moving almost mechanically. Every step seemed to echo through the infinite expanse, though I knew no one could hear me. The fog thickened as I approached a cluster of figures huddled together in a loose circle. As I drew closer, I realized with growing horror that these weren't shadows, they were people. Or at least, what had been people. Their skin shimmered unnaturally, almost translucent, and their expressions were frozen mid-emotion, some in fear, some in sorrow, others in twisted, manic joy. I recognized my old neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, who had waved at me the morning I arrived in Ashwood, but now her eyes were black voids, mouth open in a silent scream. A whisper floated through the fog, soft yet impossibly close: "You've seen too much, you will join us." I stumbled backward, tripping over what I thought was a loose floorboard, only to find it was the hand of another trapped figure. The touch was cold, lifeless, and sent a shiver of terror up my spine. These were the victims of the town's cruel design, those who had dared to approach midnight, those who had disobeyed the unspoken rule. I realized with a sickening clarity that Ashwood didn't merely stop time, it collected souls, bending them into its eternal pre-midnight, ensuring they could never escape, never age, never die. The fog shifted around me, forming a narrow corridor that seemed to guide me deeper into the void. I knew instinctively that this was a test, a path the town had created for me to confront what lay at its heart. As I walked, I noticed the figures on either side beginning to stir, their movements jerky, unnatural. One stepped forward, a man I vaguely recognized from my childhood. His eyes glowed faintly, and he reached for me with a hand that seemed to stretch impossibly long, yet his lips moved silently, whispering a warning that resonated inside my skull. "Do not, stay, awake." I ran, propelled by fear, though every step felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted me. Shapes swirled in the fog, some reaching out, others vanishing before my eyes, and I realized that the town itself was alive, watching, adapting to my every move. It wasn't enough to run, I had to understand, to anticipate, or I would be claimed like the others. Then I saw it, a figure standing taller than the rest, its form indistinct but terrifyingly human. Its eyes glowed brighter than the rest, and it radiated authority, a presence that seemed to anchor the entire void. I knew instinctively that this was what the town used to control its victims, the entity that enforced the pre-midnight rule. It tilted its head slowly, observing me, and I felt a cold, invasive sensation, as though it could peer directly into my thoughts, measuring my fear, my memories, my will to survive. The whispers intensified, forming words I could barely comprehend. "You cannot resist. 1159 is eternal, you are ours." I pressed on, desperate to escape, desperate to see some glimmer of normalcy, but the corridor led me to a chamber unlike any other. It was vast, circular, and lined with mirrors that reflected not my image, but the countless versions of me that Ashwood had created over the years, frightened, twisted, hollow, screaming silently into their own reflections. The mirrors seemed to pulse with the same heartbeat as the town, and I understood that these were not reflections but potential fates, possibilities of what would happen if I failed to survive the approaching minute. And then I saw a movement that froze my blood. One of the mirrored figures stepped forward, my exact likeness, down to the smallest detail, and pressed its face against the glass, staring at me. Its eyes were black voids, and yet I felt its awareness, its hunger. A voice, unmistakably my own but layered with an alien resonance, whispered. "Midnight will take you. You belong here. You cannot leave." I staggered back, my heart pounding, and realized the truth I had been avoiding. Ashwood wasn't just a town, it was a living entity, a predator that fed on fear, defiance, and curiosity. Those who disobeyed the rules didn't simply vanish, they became part of the town, twisted into shadows, mirrors, and whispers, eternal witnesses to the next victim's descent. And now, as the next 11:59 approached, I understood that I was on the precipice of that transformation. I had to find a way out. I had to survive. But as the minutes ticked closer, I felt the air grow heavier, the shadows denser, and the mirrors closer. Ashwood was preparing. And I realized, with absolute clarity, that the town had been waiting for me to make my choice, fight, or be consumed like all those before me. I forced myself to keep moving, though every step felt like walking through thick molasses, as if the air itself sought to drag me down. The mirrors lining the circular chamber pressed closer with every heartbeat, reflecting endless versions of me, versions that screamed silently, twisted in anguish, eyes black as voids. Their presence was suffocating, a constant reminder of the fate that awaited me if I faltered. I stumbled over the uneven floor, tripping on a seam in the fog that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Somewhere in the distance, a low hum began, resonating through the chamber like the throbbing pulse of some enormous organism. It was Ashwood, alive and aware, and it was measuring me. Desperation clawed at my chest as I noticed a faint glow along the far edge of the room. The light was weak but steady, almost inviting. I ran toward it, ignoring the tugging of the air and the mirror's silent demands. As I neared, the glow intensified, revealing a doorway partially obscured by shifting fog. Relief surged, but it was quickly replaced by terror when the mirrored versions of me began moving, breaking their frozen stances. They stepped closer to the glass walls, synchronized, reaching with elongated hands as though to grab my essence. The closer I came to the doorway, the more insistent their movements became, until it felt like the very chamber was leaning toward me, trying to trap me in this reflection-filled prison forever. I burst through the doorway into a long hallway, infinitely stretching, walls coated in peeling wallpaper and old photographs, faded by time yet eerily clear in the dim light. I recognized some faces, my childhood friends, neighbors, even my parents, but all with subtle, impossible distortions, eyes that blinked too slowly, smiles that lingered too long, shadows that moved independently of their bodies. Each photograph seemed alive, watching me, judging me. The whispers returned, louder, now overlapping. "You cannot escape, we know. 11:59 is eternal." Panic gnawed at me, but I forced myself forward. I had to understand the rules of this nightmare if I was to survive. The hallway stretched endlessly, doors appearing at irregular intervals. Each door had a name carved into it, names of people I knew, and names of people I didn't, but the date next to each name was always the same, 11:59. The doors seemed to pulse, alive with the memory of those who had dared stay awake too long. Some doors rattled violently, others remained perfectly still, but I understood instinctively, they were not exits, they were prisons, markers of Ashwood's victims, and I had only a limited window to act before I joined them. I pressed on, moving deeper into the hall, when a new sound reached me, footsteps, deliberate and echoing, but not my own. I spun around, heart hammering, and saw nothing, yet the footsteps grew louder, circling me, closing in. Shadows coalesced into forms, humanoid but twisted, stretching impossibly tall, their movements fluid yet unnatural. Their faces were blurred, ever-shifting, but one feature remained constant, eyes black and empty, staring straight through me. I realized these were Ashwood sentinels, entities born from the town itself, tasked with ensuring that no one survived the pre-midnight hour. Desperation sharpened my focus. I had to find something, anything, that could give me leverage against this living nightmare. That's when I noticed a faint glimmer on the floor, a set of markings etched into the wood beneath the fog. Kneeling, I traced the lines, and a horrifying understanding dawned. They were instructions, left by past survivors who had attempted to escape, scratched into the very foundation of the town. The symbols pulsed faintly, guiding me toward a room at the far end of the hallway. I followed the markings, adrenaline surging, the whispers and shadows converging behind me like a living tide. As I neared the room, I realized it wasn't just a room, it was a library, filled with books, scrolls, and diaries, each chronicling the history of Ashwood and its victims. Pages fluttered in the air, turning themselves to reveal passages detailing the town's predatory nature, its manipulation of time, and the horrors of those who had crossed the 1159 threshold. Some pages depicted horrifying illustrations of people frozen mid-action, swallowed by fog, eyes hollow and screaming silently. I frantically searched through the texts, hoping for a clue, anything that could save me. And then I found it, a diary, worn and water-stained, belonging to a man named Elias, a previous victim who had managed to resist for weeks before ultimately succumbing. His final entries were scrawled in desperate, shaky handwriting. The town is alive, it feeds on fear, mirrors and shadows are its sentinels, find the clock, understand its rhythm, only then, you may survive, but it will never forgive hesitation. I realized then that the clock, the one frozen at 11:59, was not just a symbol but the core of Ashwood's power. Destroying it, or perhaps understanding its mechanics, might be the only way to break free. But as I lifted my head, I saw movement in the corner of the room. Shadows twisted into human shapes, reaching out with impossibly long fingers, the mirrored versions of me closing in from the hall. Their whispering merged into a single, overwhelming chorus. You cannot resist, you are ours. 11:59 is eternal. I backed against a bookshelf, heart racing, realizing with gut-wrenching clarity that Ashwood was testing me, observing how I reacted, measuring my fear. And I understood, every choice I made, every hesitation, brought me closer to becoming part of the town's endless, pre-midnight cycle. I had no time left. The next 11:59 was approaching, and with it, the full weight of Ashwood's hunger. I clutched Elias' diary, scanning the pages for the final instructions, my mind racing. The room pulsed with an energy that was almost tangible, shadows pressing inward, the whispers now screaming, urging me toward despair. I had to act, now, or become just another face frozen in the fog, another victim whose name would be etched into Ashwood's walls for eternity. Clutching Elias' diary to my chest, I felt the weight of the town pressing in from all sides. The whispers had intensified, a cacophony of voices blending into a single, oppressive hum that rattled my skull. Shadows writhed along the walls, stretching toward me with elongated limbs, fingers splayed like claws, and eyes that glimmered faintly with malicious intelligence. I could feel Ashwood watching, calculating every heartbeat, every hesitant step. Time itself felt liquid, melting, untrustworthy, and I realized that hesitation could cost me more than my life, it could cost me my very existence. I forced myself to focus, flipping frantically through Elias' final entries. They spoke of the clock at the center of the town's power, the frozen 11:59, and hinted at a rhythm, a hidden cadence that, if understood, might allow someone to navigate Ashwood's labyrinth without being consumed. I read the words over and over, trying to imprint them on my memory. The clock listens, mirrors obey, shadows judge, move with the pulse, and you may endure. Fail, and you join the cycle. The instructions were cryptic, almost maddeningly so, but I clung to them like a lifeline. I stepped cautiously toward the hallway leading back to the chamber where the clock pulsed like a heartbeat. The fog thickened, swirling around my ankles, and the whispers morphed into coherent phrases. You cannot escape, time belongs to us, the minute never ends. I realized then that the figures trapped in the fog were not merely observers, they were extensions of Ashwood itself, sentinels designed to corral, confuse, and terrify. They reached toward me, fingers brushing the edge of my jacket, yet I forced myself to move in time with a rhythm I could feel in my chest, a slow, steady beat, almost imperceptible, as if the town's heartbeat had synced with mine. The corridor stretched endlessly, doors appearing and disappearing like flickering candlelight. Shadows danced along the walls, sometimes stretching impossibly tall, sometimes flattening into grotesque masks of my own face. One door caught my attention, marked with the name of someone I had known as a child, now long gone. A faint light emanated from beneath it, flickering in a rhythm matching the pulsing of the clock. I hesitated, fear clawing at me, but the diary's words echoed, "Move with the pulse, and you may endure." I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside was a room I had never seen before, filled with mirrors that reflected not reality but possibilities, versions of me frozen in moments of despair, panic, and defiance. The mirrors weren't just images, they were warnings, lessons etched into reflective surfaces, each one showing what would happen if I failed to adhere to the rhythm. And then I saw a figure in one of the mirrors, not a reflection, but moving independently, my own exact likeness, eyes black voids, reaching for me from the glass. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized this was what Ashwood created to replace those who faltered, a perfect, obedient copy that would eventually take my place in the town's eternal cycle. I backed away, heart hammering, but the room seemed to shift around me, the mirrors tilting, the floor slanting. The shadows from the hallway slithered beneath the walls, entering the room, reaching toward me with fingers that left trails of inky blackness in their wake. I could hear whispers directly inside my head now. "You belong to 11:59, join us, there is no escape." Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to focus on the pulse, the subtle, underlying beat I had sensed from the beginning. I synchronized my movements with it, step by step, hand over hand, as though my survival depended on following an invisible metronome. The mirrors trembled and warped as I moved, some cracking slightly, revealing glimpses of the void beyond, the endless fog filled with trapped souls. I understood that the rhythm was more than a guideline, it was a language, a code imposed by the town itself. Each movement in harmony with the pulse allowed me to navigate through the chamber without attracting the attention of Ashwood's sentinels. But deviation, hesitation, or fear caused the shadows to surge, the whispers to intensify, and the mirrors to animate in terrifying ways. I had little room for error, and every instinct screamed that failure meant becoming another frozen witness. Finally, I reached a central mirror, larger than the rest, and etched with intricate symbols glowing faintly in the pulsing light. Elias' diary had described it vaguely, the heart of 11:59, the point where the town's power converged. I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling a sudden vibration, a surge of energy that threatened to knock me off my feet. The mirrored version of me in the center reflected not just my image but my fears, my memories, my very essence. Its eyes glowed brighter, its mouth moving silently, whispering a single phrase that reverberated in my mind: "Join us, or be consumed." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to act. Remembering Elias' final instructions, I synchronized my breathing, heartbeat, and steps to the pulse emanating from the mirror. Slowly, I began to manipulate the energy around me, pressing my awareness into the rhythm, bending the shadows and whispers to follow my cadence rather than Ashwood's. For the first time, I felt a sliver of control, a possibility that survival might not be impossible. But just as hope surged, the mirrored figure lunged, shattering the glass with a deafening crash. Shards flew, cutting through the fog, and I staggered backward, realizing with a sickening clarity that Ashwood would not yield easily. The sentinels pressed in, the whispers screamed, and the hallway outside seemed to twist further, elongating into impossible angles. I was no longer merely navigating the town, I was fighting against it, every step a battle of will, every breath a defiance against its predatory power. And then I heard it, a sound beneath the chaos, faint but unmistakable, the ticking of the clock, growing louder, insistent, counting down to the next 11:59. The minute I had feared all along was approaching, and I knew that my next choice could determine whether I survived or became just another shadow in the fog, another victim etched into Ashwood's eternal cycle. I could feel the walls of Ashwood closing in, the fog thickening until every shadow felt alive, writhing as if it had a mind of its own. The clock's ticking reverberated through my bones, each strike an omen, each vibration a pulse of the town's malevolent heartbeat. I pressed forward, clutching Elias' diary, my only guide through this nightmare. Every step was an effort, as if the air itself resisted me, tugging at my limbs, whispering in voices that were not human, promising safety only in surrender. The corridor twisted impossibly, bending back on itself in ways that defied logic. Hallways that should have been straight warped into spirals, floors slanted, ceilings lowered. I stumbled over invisible edges, catching myself just in time, and realized that Ashwood was testing me, measuring my reactions, pushing me to falter. I glanced at the shadows sliding along the walls, humanoid yet grotesquely distorted, their forms stretching and shrinking unpredictably, eyes glinting with a predatory intelligence. They had become aware of my defiance, and now they were closing in faster, synchronized with the pulse of the clock that I had been trying to follow. Ahead, I glimpsed a massive archway, framed by broken mirrors and etched with strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the dim light. The diary had referred to this, the Chamber of Midnight, the place where the town's consciousness converged, where the entity controlling Ashwood manifested fully. Every step toward it felt like wading through thick water, each movement resisted by a force that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I realized that Ashwood wasn't merely a town, it was a living predator, feeding not on flesh but on fear, defiance, and the very essence of time. As I approached the chamber, the fog parted slightly, revealing figures frozen mid-motion, victims who had dared to reach this far in past cycles. Their eyes were black voids, their mouths open in silent screams, hands reaching for freedom they would never have. A chill ran down my spine. I understood now, Ashwood did not merely trap its victims, it consumed their identities, folding them into itself, twisting memories and willpower into reflections, shadows, and whispers that would haunt the next intruder. The chamber door loomed ahead, massive and ancient, yet somehow organic, like it had grown from the very heart of the town. I pushed it open and entered, immediately feeling the oppressive weight of Ashwood's consciousness. The room was circular, vast beyond comprehension, its walls lined with mirrors and clocks, all ticking in irregular rhythms that made my head spin. In the center stood a figure, taller than any human, its form constantly shifting between shadow, mist, and vaguely humanoid shapes. Its eyes glowed like molten gold, and it radiated an aura that made my lungs burn with every breath. This was the entity controlling Ashwood, the consciousness that enforced the pre-midnight curse. It spoke without moving its lips, a voice that seemed to echo from every surface and directly into my mind. You have come far, yet you do not understand. Time belongs to us. Midnight does not exist here. You cannot leave what you cannot defy. I swallowed, forcing my fear down, and held up Elias' diary. I know about the rhythm. I know how this works. I can resist you, I said, my voice shaking but firm. The entity's form pulsed, rippling with black smoke and golden light, and the room responded, the mirrors vibrated, clocks spun wildly, and the shadows surged forward like a living tide. You may attempt to resist, it whispered, but all who fight become us. All who struggle join the cycle. I exhaled slowly, recalling every instruction in Elias' diary, every clue, every rhythm. I synchronized my heartbeat, my breathing, my steps with the underlying pulse I had sensed all along. The entity seemed to hesitate, its golden eyes narrowing as I manipulated the rhythm, bending the fog, shadows, and mirrors to move in tandem with me rather than against me. For the first time, I felt a measure of control. But then a horrifying realization struck, the chamber itself was alive, a part of Ashwood's consciousness. Every movement I made caused the floor to shift, the mirrors to stretch, and the clocks to tick faster. The entity raised a hand, and the mirrors rippled violently, creating countless reflections of me, each one screaming silently, reaching for me with impossibly long fingers. The shadows pressed in, whispering, "Join us." 11:59, Eternal. I backed up instinctively, but the room twisted, doors disappearing, mirrors splitting into jagged shards. The entity's voice reverberated through my mind, "The final choice is yours. Embrace the minute, and become eternal. Resist, and be shattered." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. I had no idea what the outcome would be, only that I could not falter. I pressed my awareness into the pulse, extended my consciousness into the rhythm of the town, and reached toward the central clock, the frozen 11:59, the anchor of Ashwood's power. As my fingers grazed the cold surface of the clock, the entity recoiled, shadows writhing violently, mirrors shattering, and the entire chamber trembling as if the town itself were screaming. In that moment, I understood the horrifying truth: Ashwood did not merely trap its victims. It fed on defiance, on attempts to understand or escape. But perhaps, if I could bend the rhythm, synchronize fully with its pulse rather than oppose it directly, I might survive. The next heartbeat echoed through the chamber, louder than any before. The final 11:59 approached, and I realized there was no room for hesitation. My choice would decide not only my fate, but whether Ashwood could continue its endless cycle of terror. The chamber shook violently as I pressed my palm against the frozen clock, the pulse of Ashwood reverberating through every fiber of my being. Shadows twisted and writhed around me, black tendrils stretching toward me from every mirror, every cracked wall, whispering my name in tones that were at once familiar and wrong. The entity at the center of the room pulsed like molten gold and ink, towering over me yet somehow aware of the tiniest hesitation. I clenched my teeth, forcing my fear down, and reminded myself of Elias' words: "Move with the pulse, and you may endure. Fail, and you join the cycle." The rhythm of the town was maddeningly complex. Each second seemed to stretch and contract simultaneously, clocks spinning backward and forward, floors rising and falling in impossible angles. The mirrors reflected not just me, but my memories, fears, and potential futures. In some, I saw myself screaming silently, trapped in fog and shadows. In others, I watched myself collapse, eyes hollow, becoming one of Ashwood's extensions. It was overwhelming, a mental assault designed to break anyone who dared touch the heart of the town. But somehow, I forced myself to synchronize every thought, every breath, every heartbeat with the hidden pulse I had sensed from the beginning. I focused on the central clock. Its hands were frozen at 11:59, but I could feel the energy contained within it, the very essence of Ashwood's predatory power. My fingers grazed the cold metal, and the entity recoiled as though I had struck it physically. The mirrors trembled violently, the shadows recoiling momentarily. I realized that I could influence Ashwood's rhythm by aligning myself perfectly with it, bending the town's pulse to my will. But the strain was immense, every second felt like an eternity, and the whispers intensified, 1,000 voices screaming in my mind, urging me to fail, to collapse, to surrender. Suddenly, the entity lunged, a massive wave of shadows cascading over me. I felt their tendrils wrap around my limbs, pulling, twisting, trying to drag me into the mirrored reflections. Panic surged, but I remembered the pulse. I moved with it, fluid, precise, countering the entity's attacks not with force but with rhythm. The shadows recoiled, twisting back into jagged shapes, and the mirrors cracked and splintered under the strain. I could hear a low, guttural roar emanating from the chamber, as if Ashwood itself were screaming in rage at my defiance. Then, the impossible happened. I felt the clock's pulse merging with mine, a terrifying, exhilarating sensation as though I were becoming part of the town without surrendering to it. The entity faltered, its molten form flickering, unstable. I pressed harder, extending my awareness into the rhythm, and realized that Ashwood's power was not infinite, it relied on feeding on those who faltered, those who hesitated. If I could maintain perfect synchronization, I could disrupt its cycle, unbalance it long enough to escape. My mind reeled with the enormity of the task. Every misstep, every doubt, could cost me my existence. The shadows lunged again, this time more aggressively, mirrors shattering with deafening cracks as the room convulsed. The entity's voice boomed inside my head, louder and more insistent. You cannot unmake what we have woven. Midnight does not exist. You cannot survive. I focused harder, letting the rhythm guide me. Step by step, breath by breath, I bent the entity's power, using its own pulse against it. The mirrors warped violently, some collapsing inward, others exploding into shards that floated in the air, suspended like fragments of a shattered reality. The shadows shrieked, twisting into forms I could barely recognize, yet every movement I made countered their assault. The clock's hands quivered, trembling for the first time in decades, and I realized I had found the point of leverage. Ashwood's core was vulnerable if confronted precisely through the rhythm. Then I acted. I pressed my entire being into the pulse, extending my consciousness into the heart of Ashwood, feeling its hunger, its centuries of control, its countless victims. I spoke, not aloud, but within the rhythm itself, a defiance that resonated with the hidden cadence of the town. You do not control me. I will not become one of you. I will not surrender to 1159. The entity screamed, a soundless wail that vibrated through my mind, body, and soul. The chamber convulsed violently, walls bending, mirrors exploding, shadows writhing and dissolving into nothingness. I felt the pulse falter, flicker, and then, silence. The clock's hands quivered one final time, then fell backward, slowly, impossibly, until midnight passed. For the first time in centuries, the town exhaled. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted beyond comprehension, but alive. The mirrors were still, the shadows gone, the whispers silent. The entity, or whatever remained of it, had retreated, leaving only an empty echo of its presence. Ashwood itself seemed diminished, its malevolent pulse weakened, its grip on time loosened. I knew this was not complete victory. Ashwood was patient, eternal, but I had survived. I had defied the pre-midnight, and the town's secret no longer had absolute control over me. But as I staggered toward the exit, a new horror struck. In the shattered mirror shards scattered across the floor, I saw faces staring back at me, not just my own, but the faces of those who had tried and failed. Their eyes were hollow, mouths open in silent screams, yet somehow, they seemed to be warning me, Ashwood's cycle was far from over. Midnight had been cheated, but the town remembered. And I had awakened it fully. I stepped out of the chamber, trembling, every nerve on fire, into the fog-choked streets of Ashwood. The town looked deceptively calm, almost mundane under the dim glow of street lamps that flickered weakly against the haze. But I knew better. I had felt the pulse, the heartbeat of Ashwood, and it had not been silenced. It had only been delayed, restrained, but patient, cunning, and eternal. The town seemed to breathe around me, windows shimmering as if alive, shadows twisting along the walls, ready to consume any flicker of doubt or weakness. I wandered through familiar streets that had somehow grown strange in their familiarity. Every house I passed seemed to watch me, their bricked-up doors hiding secrets older than I had imagined. The clocks had stopped at 12:01, just past the forbidden hour, but their faces seemed almost to mock me, frozen in smug awareness. I realized then that time in Ashwood was a living entity, pliable and responsive, a predator with infinite patience. Midnight may have passed this time, but the town itself was still very much awake, still very much aware of me. In the square, I found the fountain where children had once played, water shimmering eerily in the fog. And there they were, the town's forgotten victims, standing silently around the fountain, faces pale, eyes hollow. They didn't move, but I felt their gaze, accusing and sorrowful, directed at me. Elias' voice echoed in my mind, "They are warnings. They are what remains of those who failed." I understood now that Ashwood didn't merely trap people, it preserved them, twisted them into reminders of its control. Every failed soul was a piece of its consciousness, a shard of the rhythm I had barely survived. I pressed onward, knowing that my escape depended on reaching the town's outer edge, beyond the fog, beyond the pulse, beyond the influence of Ashwood. Every step was a battle, the streets seemed to stretch and contract, houses leaning inwards like predatory jaws. Shadows stretched long across cobblestones, merging into the darkness, forming grotesque shapes that whispered my name. Yet, I clung to the pulse I had synchronized with, my heart matching its rhythm perfectly, a fragile tether to reality. Suddenly, I heard the entity's voice, not booming this time, but calm, almost intimate, as if it were speaking directly into my bones. You think you have defeated me. You think midnight is yours. But I am not the clock, and I am not the fog. I am the town, and the town is eternal. My blood ran cold. I realized the horrifying truth: the entity had never been just the central figure in the chamber. It was the entirety of Ashwood, every brick, every shadow, every whispered warning. I hadn't defeated it, I had only awakened its attention fully, drawn its awareness to me in a way that would make the next cycle even more dangerous. Then I saw them, the townsfolk, waving politely as I had once been warned. But now their faces were subtly wrong, slightly too symmetrical, eyes glimmering faintly in gold, smiles fixed unnaturally wide. They were aware of me, measuring me, waiting. And I realized that I had never been a visitor to Ashwood. I had always been part of its rhythm, a piece of its eternal puzzle it had let wander, testing my resolve, pushing me to defiance, preparing me to understand the truth. A cold wind blew, and the fog surged, forming the streets anew. My house, my childhood home, appeared ahead, as if it had grown from the mist itself. I knew then that escape might not exist, not in the way I had hoped. Ashwood didn't need to trap me physically, it trapped me in time, in perception, in awareness. Every step I had taken, every pulse I had followed, had led me to this realization: the town itself was a living labyrinth, and I had become both observer and participant, a ghost already woven into its eternal narrative. And then the final revelation struck me with bone-shattering clarity. The diary, the pulse, the rhythm, it had all been a lure. Elias had survived, yes, but only because he had become part of Ashwood too. Every instruction I had followed, every beat I had synchronized with, had been designed to prepare me. Ashwood didn't just feed on fear, it fed on understanding, on the defiance that allowed someone to see the town's mechanisms. I had become its most aware subject yet, and in my awareness, I had bound myself more tightly to its cycle than anyone before. I stumbled into the square again, surrounded by the pale figures of past victims. Their eyes were no longer empty, they glimmered knowingly, silently observing me, waiting. The town hummed around me, the whispers, the heartbeat, the fog, all in perfect harmony. I understood now that the pre-midnight curse was not about survival or death. It was about becoming conscious of Ashwood, integrating into its eternal narrative, and realizing that escape was an illusion. Midnight had never been forbidden, it had been irrelevant. Time here was Ashwood, and Ashwood was infinite. As the fog thickened again, swallowing the streets and the frozen clock towers, I felt my body begin to dissolve into the rhythm, my consciousness stretching, pulling apart and weaving into the town's pulse. I screamed, not in fear, but in understanding, as the walls closed around me, the mirrors reflected not me, but what I had become, and the whispers of Ashwood murmured one final, chilling truth: you are no longer a visitor. You are the town. And the town is eternal. I felt myself fully consumed, not in pain, but in awareness, integrated into the infinite labyrinth of Ashwood, a piece of the cycle that would never end. Midnight passed, and the town exhaled, patient, eternal, waiting for the next heartbeat to awaken the next visitor. Ashwood's true horror had been revealed. It was not merely a cursed town, it was a sentient, eternal predator, and anyone who became aware of its rhythm became a permanent part of its living cycle. The pre-midnight warning was never about survival, it was about assimilation, and now the protagonist, and the audience, fully understood the terrifying inevitability of the town's power.